Hi, my name is Matt and I'm a physical therapist at the Cleveland Clinic Sports Health Center, as well as the founder and chairperson of its Combat Sports Special Interest Group. And today, I'm going to talk to you about how to fix a broken fighter, or what I like to call, from the foot to the face, mixed martial arts. I'll do this by going over some MMA-specific aspects of rehab and strength and conditioning, and talk to you about how you can incorporate them into your physical therapy practice. Because this sport has grown tremendously recently and shows no signs of slowing down. However, up until recently, it's either been ignored or in some cases outrightly condemned by most major medical communities, which has led to these fighters seeking their rehab care from wherever they can find it. Sometimes that's a chiropractor or a strength and conditioning coach, but at its worst, it's Google, or simply the guy that's been training in the gym the longest. We're the experts in rehabbing athletes, right? This is Dominic Cruz, the former UFC bantamweight champion. He tore his ACL training for a fight, had surgery, did his therapy, and then went out and tore his ACL again. When asked about it by a reporter, this is what he had to say. And if you're a physical therapist, I hope that this really upsets you because it really aggravated me. What do you mean, I don't know what's going on? But when I started to look into it, he's not really that far off. To fix this, we have to ask ourselves, what is an MMA athlete? One of the easy ways I thought I could do that was by looking at the athletic backgrounds of some of the more prominent UFC fighters. I mean, come on, how complicated could these guys be? I'm very proud to say that this is Stipe Miocic, the UFC heavyweight champion. He played baseball and wrestled at Cleveland State University, which is a smaller Division I school, and he's also a Golden Gloves boxer and still works as a part-time firefighter. Since we're in San Antonio, this is Donald Cowboy Cerrone, who's considered to be one of the top UFC light and welterweight fighters. He's a former professional bull rider, and also an avid rock climber and wakeboarder. And this studly fellow here is former UFC middleweight champion Luke Rockhold. He's an avid surfer and skateboarder, but also, ironically, he's a professional model, who in an unrelated note recently broke up with singer Demi Lovato. So as you can see, that didn't really help me at all. But I was able to find a 2016 systematic review in the journal Sports Medicine that tried to answer that question by looking at the physical and physiological characteristics of MMA fighters. One of the problems that the authors ran into, however, is that there wasn't enough data on pure MMA athletes. So it forced them to look at the component arts that make up mixed martial arts. After going through all of that data and research, the answer to the question of what is an MMA athlete was, it's complicated. MMA athletes displayed an incredibly wide and complex spectrum of physical abilities. On one end, being able to generate incredibly large amounts of neuromuscular power and force production, but on the other end, demonstrating incredibly well-adapted aerobic and anaerobic metabolisms. Based off of the research from the systematic review, the authors described the sport of MMA as high-intensity engagements interspersed within constant lower-intensity activity. Large amounts of strength are needed for grappling maneuvers like this armbar seen here, which is a common submission move used in MMA where you attempt to hyperextend your opponent's elbow so much that they either tap out due to pain or you break their arm. It requires a large amount of strength from the fighter on the bottom who's attempting to apply it, but also from the fighter on the top who's trying not to have her arm broke. Quick bursts of power are needed for rearranging your opponent's face with punches, as well as for the other forms of striking allowed in MMA, which include striking with the knees, elbows, and kicks with the feet. And combinations of strength and power are needed for things like this double leg takedown, as well as for clinch fighting, which is standing grappling with close quarter strikes. Now, another interesting result of the systematic review was that the manner in which some of the fighters displayed certain physical characteristics depended on their training background and history. You see, since MMA is still kind of a new and, let's be honest, somewhat contentious sport, not very many little kids grow up saying, I want to be a cage fighter. But they do tend to come from the component arts that make up mixed martial arts. For example, all the fighters in the systematic review displayed a high level of physical strength. But if they came from primarily a grappling background, they demonstrated larger amounts of isometric strength, which may be due to the constant gripping, pushing, and pulling. Versus if they came from primarily a striking background, they demonstrated larger amounts of dynamic strength, which may be more suited to the quick punching and kicking. All of this makes talking to your fighter about their training age and history incredibly important. Asking them how long they've been training, what arts they've been training in, and what level do they train and or compete at helps you to establish a relationship with the fighter. It helps them to trust you. It also helps you to determine expectations and set realistic goals, all of which has been proven in the literature to help increase physical therapy compliance. But it's not that these fighters are lazy, quite the contrary, they do some of the hardest workouts I've ever seen. But it's that they don't trust us. And why should they? How would you feel if your sport used to be referred to as human cockfighting? Or every time you went to the doctor, you were likely to hear the words, you should probably just stop doing that. Getting the fighter to trust you is incredibly important. Finally, after almost 2 years away from this sport, 2 ACL surgeries, and being forced to give up his UFC championship belt, Dominick Cruz finally had this to say about physical therapy. But what do you think he means by full body workouts? I'd like to think he found a physical therapist that considered the entire kinetic chain, which is a theory that states that dynamic upper and lower extremity movements are the result of integrated and sequential joint motions as well as muscle activations. Power is produced in the core and fired out through the limbs, and it requires that you establish proper alignment and motion at all segments throughout the kinetic chain. For example, if you're treating an athlete with a shoulder injury, you're taking a look at their back, hips, knees, and even their feet and ankles. Because myofascial linkages like the ones seen here have been well documented in the literature, but also a recent experimental study done in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy took a look at if recruitment of these muscles would affect EMG serratus anterior activity during a punching motion. Now, the results of this study demonstrated that EMG activity went up when you recruited the trunk or the leg muscles, but that it went up the most with what they called the serape effect. Now, a serape is a scarf or garment that gets wrapped around your body, but for our purposes, it's the trunk and leg muscles arranged in series along spiral lines seen here. To think about this from a sport-specific perspective, let's take a look at a right cross, which is a commonly used punch thrown during MMA fights. Beginners are instructed to throw this punch by doing 3 things. Drive and pivot off their back foot, rotate their hips towards their target, and then quickly snap their arm out and bring it back into a defensive position. And the kinetic chain also works for kicking as well. As a single factor, repeated measured doctoral thesis took a look at kinetic and kinematic variables of the roundhouse kick thrown by Muay Thai practitioners. And the results of the study demonstrated that a maximum final ankle velocity or higher final ankle velocity and a higher training age significantly correlated with increased kicking force. Let's think about that for a second. The faster you can get the distal aspect of your striking limb to move meant that you could kick harder. But what about training age? The author felt that a higher training age meant that the fighters had better form, or as you're about to see, might mean that they had better utilization of those trunk and leg muscle connections. Also, another interesting result of the study was that it showed a sequential peak in lower extremity acceleration from proximal to distal. The thigh peaked in acceleration first, followed by the knee, shank, and finally the ankle before impact with the target. Again, to think about this from a sport-specific perspective, let's take a look at a roundhouse kick, which is a powerful kick used very frequently in MMA fights. Again, beginners are instructed to do a few basic things. First is step forward and pivot on your lead foot. Turn your hips over, and then counter-rotate your trunk and swing your right arm in an attempt to utilize those serape connections to help increase the striking speed of your leg, and finally impact the bag just at the distal aspect of your shin above your toes. All of this just makes optimizing motion and stability throughout the entire kinetic chain your number one priority when rehabbing MMA athletes. Next, we're going to look at some of the other important puzzle pieces that make up rehabbing the MMA fighter, beginning with single leg balance and control, which is important for offensive reasons such as this hip toss takedown, but also for defensive reasons and from an injury prevention standpoint. Look at the fighter on your right. As he pivots on that left leg to throw that roundhouse kick, the only thing connecting him to the ground is a large amount of dynamic single leg balance. Now look at the fighter on your left. As he attempts to check or block that roundhouse kick, the only thing connecting him to the ground or keeping him from getting knocked over is a large amount of static single leg support on his stance leg. Combinations of dynamic and single leg balance are needed for defending things like this single leg takedown, all the while trying not to get yourself punched in the face at the same time. And while all forms of kicking in MMA require some level of balance on one leg, as you're about to see, some of them require just a little bit more than others. Watch his left foot as he executes a pirouette-like movement before smacking the heel of his right foot upside that poor guy's head. And some people think MMA is not the arts. Also, from an injury prevention standpoint, we know that rotation around a planted foot is one of the primary causes of ACL tears, and that neuromuscular and dynamic balance training may be able to help reduce some of that injury risk. All of this just makes things like the squat a great tool for looking at trunk, pelvis, and lower extremity movements, and trying to identify any faulty movement patterns, such as poor trunk or pelvic control, or any increase in E valgus. Also, another recent lab study done in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy demonstrated that you can manipulate kinematic variables in the stance leg simply by changing the position of the non-stance leg. For example, this athlete's non-stance leg was in the back position, which according to the study increased the knee extensor moment on his stance leg, potentially emphasizing those quadricep muscles. If we had him move his non-stance leg into more of a middle or front position, it would increase the hip extensor moment on his stance leg, potentially emphasizing the glutes and the hamstrings. And once you've gotten a good handle on single leg balance and control, agility is the ability to move quickly and change directions with ease. Quick and accurate foot placements is essential in MMA to control positioning, for striking distance, as well as for completing and defending takedowns. Speed ladder drills can replicate many of the common footwork movements used in MMA. An example was this lateral speed ladder drill that mimicked the required footwork for entering and exiting striking combinations. In MMA, it's generally a bad idea to charge straight at your opponent, but most movements occur in diagonal or lateral planes. Also, a diagonal speed ladder drill, like the one seen here, can replicate the 45-degree anterior foot placement needed for throwing that roundhouse kick. And to combine upper and lower extremity movements, Shadow boxing is a drill that asks your athlete to perform sports-specific striking movements, emphasizing flow and technique. It can be progressed from slow to fast, and from simple to complex combinations, and it can be used to help your athlete progressively get back to punching and kicking. This is Bruce Lee, who's considered to be one of the greatest martial artists of all time. He was very famous for being able to generate large amounts of force in a very short space, seen here by this 1-inch and following 6-inch punch. He did this by not only being very strong, but also by being very fast, which is the definition of power, or force times velocity. And power has been stated to be a defining quality of superior competitors in high-intensity interval collision sports, which kind of sounds like a fancy way of saying sports where you repetitively hit each other. Also, a cross-sectional study done in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research took a look at factors that affected punching force in a group of elite amateur boxers. And interestingly, the results of the study demonstrated that size doesn't matter. This is a former patient of mine who's 3-0 as an MMA bantamweight, meaning when he fights, he weighs 135 pounds. According to the study, body mass index had the lowest correlation with increased punching force compared to lower extremity strength via a 1-rep max squat and lower extremity power via a squat jump, which, if you think about it, kind of sounds like the triple extension concept, which is defined by the generation of power produced by the simultaneous extension of the hips, knees, and ankles. Triple extension exercises like this one can help your athlete regain their power, and these exercises have been stated to mimic many of the common movements used in MMA, such as this suplex takedown seen here on your right. Now, MMA requires movements in multiple planes of motion, but control of the transverse plane has been stated to be particularly important, because the lumbar spine allows for force transfer from the legs to the arms, with trunk and pelvic speed contributing to increased striking limb speed. But you have to have control. As an observational study done in the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport took a look at punching factors in a group of karate black belts and compared it to a bunch of karate novices. Naturally, the black belts demonstrated higher forearm speed, hit harder, and pushed their targets back further. But they also demonstrated significantly lower backward center of pressure displacements. English translation, they demonstrated better body control, or more of an upright trunk position. Control of the trunk while the limbs are moving is essential in MMA, and exercises that can help you challenge this are variations of the chop like the ones seen here. Also, eccentric is essential for blocking strikes in MMA, as well as for decelerating the limbs before impact and controlling for missed punches and kicks. As an American Journal of Sports Medicine case series took a look at a group of boxers and kickboxers that all complained of pain and swelling at the elbow after missing punches. All of these fighters went on to develop posterior bony elbow impingement and osteophyte formation that required surgery to fix, which the authors believed was due to the repetitive hyperextension trauma at the elbow from not controlling for those missed punches. Now, a little while ago, there was another study published in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy that took a look at factors at upper body tests for power and their ability to predict a distance throw. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that punching and throwing are not the same thing, but they do both share force generation from the legs and the core. And interestingly, the results of the study demonstrated that the modified pull-up seen here had the highest correlation with the distance throw, due to the muscles involved being stabilizers and decelerators that resist distraction forces in the arm. While it wasn't specifically tested for this, we may be able to use the modified pull-up in a similar manner to help our fighters control for those missed punches. That's great, but what about kicking? Well, another recent study done in the journal Orthopedic Reviews took a look at characteristics of MMA fights and compared them to muscle damage marker protein levels in the blood afterwards. The results of the study demonstrated that a higher number of failed or missed kicks significantly correlated with increased muscle damage marker protein levels in the blood after the fight, due to the eccentric action of certain lower extremity muscles needed to help slow down and control those missed kicks. And that by eccentrically strengthening some of these muscles, we may be able to help mitigate that effect. A great exercise that can help you do that is the straight-legged deadlift seen here. It asks your athlete to maintain single leg stance stability and control. It eccentrically strengthens the glutes and the hamstrings, and it asks them to maintain trunk and pelvic stability, all of which is essential in MMA. Next up, we're going to look at some strength and conditioning concepts that can help our athletes regain their power. Beginning with the concept of effective mass, which is defined by the global stiffening or contraction of the limb and trunk muscles right before impact with whatever you're trying to hit or kick. This global stiffening is thought to increase force transfer through to your target, but the timing of the contraction is incredibly important, as tightening up the muscles too early simply slows the striking limb down, but tightening them too late simply pushes your target, or it's like hitting them with a wet noodle. An EMG study done in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research demonstrated this concept by showing a double peak in EMG activation of the trunk muscles in elite MMA athletes while they were throwing punches and kicks. The first peak in EMG activity happened at the initiation of the strike, followed by a decrease in trunk muscle activation, with the second peak coming right before impact with the target. Now, there's no researched way to train for this, and the authors of that study stated that the best way was simply through experience. And although it sounds like an awful lot of fun, we can't just have our athletes running around the physical therapy gym doing nothing but punching stuff. I already get enough weird looks from other people's patients as it is. But we can attempt to influence this by trying to train the rate of contraction and relaxation, and you can do that with a contract-relax push-up seen here. The athlete assumes a push-up position and you cue them to relax every muscle in their body. On your signal, they do a push-up as fast as they can and attempt to return to that relaxed position. Next up, complex is a method that pairs a high load with a kinematically similar high velocity exercise, which is thought to induce a post-activation potentiation in the muscle to help increase power generation. A physical therapy example of this would be doing a single leg squat or sit to stand followed by a single leg hop for distance, which may help your athlete regain their ability to smash their knee into their opponent's chin. Unfortunately, a systematic review done in the journal Strength and Conditioning stated that increased research is needed to truly determine the validity of complex training at improving power generation compared to other more established methods of power training. But the authors did state that complex training was an efficient method of training for power, and efficiency is important in MMA. These athletes undergo striking training, grappling training, sparring days, as well as strength and conditioning sessions and cardio workouts. And that doesn't even include things like a regular full-time job or family obligations. Efficiency is important. Also, those same authors stated that complex training wasn't detrimental to any other physical therapy or physical characteristics. So based off of the research that they had, they recommended that the high-load exercise be at least 75% of your patient's 1 rep max, and that the interval between the two be at least between 1 to 2 minutes. Finally, high-intensity interval training, ironically abbreviated as HIIT, combines periods of intense exercise with periods of less intense exercise, which, if you think about it, kind of sounds like the definition of MMA that systematic review gave us at the beginning of my presentation. HIIT training has been stated in the literature to be able to simultaneously improve an athlete's aerobic as well as anaerobic capacity without adversely affecting power generation. Sounds like it might be kind of useful for MMA training. An easy way we can incorporate this into our rehab is by creating intervals of our rehab exercises to help these athletes bridge the gap between physical therapy and return to training. Easy example of that, a set of single leg squats or sit to stand followed by a series of single leg hops, and using a core exercise like a plank as your lower intensity interval. In conclusion, despite an enormous increase in the popularity of MMA recently, there remains little to no high-level evidence in regards to the rehab and strength and conditioning of these athletes. But if we use the best available evidence and look at things in a way from the foot to the face, physical therapists can do a good job of taking care of these athletes. Which is why I created the Cleveland Clinic Combat Sports Special Interest Group 3 years ago with the goal of improving the rehabilitative care provided to combat sport athletes. And I hope that this presentation helps you do that, because these athletes break their bodies for our entertainment.
Watch this, he checks it. Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Wow! That's about as obvious as it gets. And as I told you, John Danaher, oh my God!
My goodness.
Most of these athletes that you or I will see make little to no money fighting. They have regular full-time jobs and families, in addition to a grueling full-time training schedule. But they do it for the love of the sport and the hope that someday they might make it to that next level. The least that we can do as physical therapists is a better job of putting them back together. Thank you very much. Please feel free to contact me at my email or follow me on Twitter at Matthew Hixon PT. And these are the references for this presentation.